an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School and a former Navy pilot amassing over 3,000 flight hours, including missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. His research spans military sociology, social psychology, gender bias and performance evaluations, and women's retention in the military. Dr. Smith is the author of Good Guys: How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace, co-author of Athena Rising: How and Why Men Should Mentor Women, and has published numerous journal articles and book chapters on these pivotal topics. Today, Dr. Smith will share his insights on mentorships and cross-gender workplace relations. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. David Smith.
Thank you. So in the context of the last panel, why am I here today? More importantly, as you look around the room here today, and thanks first for the men that are here today in the room, but why aren't there more men here today? Right? Because I think that's the question we're looking for. Yes, there are many men out there who do care about gender equity and gender equality, and there's probably a lot that don't, but I'll bet you know some of those men who do care, and they probably have even demonstrated how they care about this. We need them here. We need them alongside all of you here in the room to talk about integration if we're going to do this right. So it's often through our shared experiences that we begin to be curious and really understand how we can collaborate to achieve more. So let me share a quick story. In the interviews we did for our second book, Good Guys, there was a great interview that I had. We had the opportunity to talk with Ambassador Don Steinberg. Many of you may know him, and those of you in the women, peace, and security realm probably do. And he shared an experience that he had when he was leading, back in the late 90s, he was leading the Angola peace process, and was really challenging because the peace talks kept falling through and violence kept re-erupting. But he said in the aftermath of a lot of these repeated failures that he was reflecting on the talks that they always followed the same process. And it was all about, let's get all the bad guys in the room with guns, let's forgive them for the atrocities that they committed, and then maybe even the atrocities they might still commit over the next 6 months. And then we're going to, the peace agreements are always going to keep going, and they're always done, they're made with these all male-led organizations. Women were never part of the process. So the peace lasted for a little while, and then, of course, violence eventually erupted again, and seemingly without any warning. Yet the reality is that women knew about this, but they weren't part of the process. How did they know? Because they spent a lot of time in markets where information was shared. This is where they knew about these upcoming acts of violence that were going to erupt. We're going to break the peace. And it's really interesting because they weren't part of the process, and women often pay a higher price when it comes to these conflicts. Ambassador Steinberg talked about how this was really his aha moment for gender equity. Right? That women need to be at the table, in the room, in the space, in the conversation, every time decisions are being made that affects them. So why aren't there more men here? Well, interestingly, those of you who've read a little bit about Athena Rising may have seen some of this, but we as men sometimes suffer this idea of we call it male reluctance syndrome, and how we... Yeah, it turns out that's the way it is. That it's this whole collection of reasons why we don't engage in gender equity initiatives or anything related to gender or women's leadership or women's challenges. And some of these are really around the idea of and you've probably heard some of these, that it's not my place, it's not my role to be involved in being there. And sometimes it's more about the biases that they may have, about seeing women as not being strong leadership material, or she's a risky investment, and so they don't engage in doing that work. Sometimes they just have flat out fear. I'm gonna say the wrong thing, I'm gonna do the wrong thing, I'm gonna step in it, and then who knows what's gonna happen, I'm gonna get fired or even worse. And then of course, believe it or not, there's a lot of men who have anxiety about workplace relationships with women. They're not really sure what that's all about. Hey, I have a wife, or I have a daughter, I have a mother. I know what that's all about. I'm really comfortable with that. But women in the workplace and in the military, yeah, I'm not so sure what that's all about. So what do you do when you're anxious about something? You avoid it, right? And the reality is that, of course, that we need more interactions. What was really interesting after we wrote the book, about a year later, Me Too went widespread. And Me Too, of course, exacerbated a lot of these issues around anxiety or fear in the workplace. And even more men were less likely to be engaged in everything from mentoring and sponsoring to just having lunch or traveling with women. And we went the wrong direction. And of course, they also spread these false narratives that women were somehow suddenly scary or dangerous, and spread false narratives about, false accusations about these things. No evidence around any of it. We looked at it very closely. But that reality is that we need more of those interactions. We need more coffees, more lunches, right? And so because we have this syndrome, this medical situation here, this disease, that we need a medical solution. So we're going to use exposure therapy to fix this, right? So we're going to force more of these interactions and lunches and do more of that. When men work alongside women as peers, when they work for women who lead them, and when they lead women, they see and they learn about the capabilities, those talents we heard about earlier, the unique differences in many cases that they bring to the organization, right? The many advantages we get when we integrate and we have a more diverse organization this way in how we accomplish the mission, get the job done. So men also learn to appreciate their different perspectives, their different points of view, and how they lead and how they get the job done. They channel their, dare I say, masculine energy. We've heard about in the news a little bit lately through more around humility, authenticity, empathy, vulnerability. You've probably heard all of those before, and yes, those are things that women use and have led with for many decades. And when men lead this way, they're more likely to advance up through their organizations and faster. We find that in the corporate world, 70% of C-suites are men who lead this way. So there are advantages there. And we found specifically in some of the research that we did that men get the benefits of things like increased access to information. They have more diverse networks. They have better communication skills. They have higher emotional intelligence. All of these things are wonderful things for us as leaders, people that we work with. But the great thing about that is that you also get to take that home with you. So it makes you a better partner and parent as well. So what motivates men to engage in working around gender equity or gender equality initiatives like this, like around women, peace, and security? When we did the research for Good Guys, we really found kind of 3 key areas. And I think these are important because this is about how do we meet people where they are and understand the motivations that bring them into this conversation that we're trying to have together. And so the 3 key areas, one is personal connection. Most men talked about how they had a personal connection. It could have been a family member, might have been a wife, a mother, a daughter, an aunt, somebody like that. Could have been a colleague or a peer at work. And it could have been a mentor, could have been a mentee, and they shared often some of these experiences that they had in the workplace, the seemingly unfair injustices that have been done, discrimination even, and it gets in touch with that sense of fairness and justice that we have. And that's really important because that sense of fairness and justice really is what motivates action, moves us forward to come together to create the kind of solutions we're looking for. So don't discount the personal connection. And often I look for it with people. I'm looking for that narrative, that story that they have around maybe something that they felt or somebody has shared with them. The second part gets to more about how they've begun to understand through their experiences in some way that this is actually good for our organization. And it's good for me as a leader. It's good for my team. And I see the advantages, the benefits. Maybe they've seen some of the research that we've talked about here today already. And that can be another powerful motivator for how do you bring them into the conversation. And then finally, a lot of men talked about this, and it almost had kind of a moral undertone to it about how it was the right thing to do. It was taking care of my people. It's who I am as a leader. It's part of my leader identity and part of my personal brand of who I am. So those were kind of the three key areas, and you may have some others out there too. That wasn't all inclusive, but those are three big ones that we often saw. It's interesting because the research also shows us that men, and again, most men do believe in gender equity. They do believe in gender equality. So if that's the case, then, and they understand a lot of these benefits, why is it taking so long to move the pendulum and really to create the kind of integration and create the kind of organizations that we're looking for? We call this the allyship gap. And the allyship gap is really, if you think about it, is sometimes about what men think they're doing, but maybe they're not actually accomplishing everything that they think they are. And some of those actions that they think they're doing, and then women tell us maybe it's something a little bit different. And oh, by the way, the research has shown us that men will say they do these things, but maybe women are like 2 to 3 times less likely to see it actually, to have the experience of these things happening in their units and their organizations. And so men giving credit to women for their contributions, men advocating for women, men calling out other men for biased or sexist behavior. And so the research shows us that when men report taking these actions, that women are saying that it's less likely to happen. But why is that? Why do we have this gap? Well, some of it's a little bit of just because I believe in it doesn't mean I'm actually doing everything I need to be doing, right, to accomplish. Am I getting the actual outcome, the actual impact result that I'm looking for? So we're missing some of that, maybe the feedback mechanism with that. Or just, again, we have a little bit of a belief, aspiration, or execution gap when it comes to that. The other thing is human beings, we tend to overestimate things. And as a gender, men overall tend to overestimate lots of things. Just watch the news. And so overestimation can be part of that as well, right? So we're, again, a bias around overestimating how much I'm actually accomplishing. We need the feedback to know, are we actually hitting the mark? Some men, because they haven't experienced it or they haven't been around people who have, they have a lack of awareness. They have a blind spot. They don't see it. They don't know, so they're not really sure. And so you just don't know how much impact you're having. And then finally, lots of men talked about how not really sure what are the best practices, what are the things I need to be doing, and how does that really make a difference? So let me turn to some ways that we can move forward, because I think that's important here. And I'll tell you some things that don't work, and then we'll talk about the things that do. So compliance doesn't work, and I think many of us have seen that through compliance training. It doesn't work. Blaming and shaming men, it's not going to get the outcome that you're looking for either. We need to find ways to include men in the conversations that we're having here today. Right? And make it part of the culture of our organizations, integrating best practices that are actionable, they're practical, into our leadership development programs, onboarding process, mentoring programs, just to name a few of the ideas that are possibilities out there. So let me define allyship real quick and the types of actions that are tied to this so you can get a better sense of what I'm talking about here. So we see it really kind of as 3 key areas. And the first is interpersonal allyship, and you can think about this, and all these have an element of accountability that go with them. The interpersonal allyship is how do I show up in the workplace every day, the kinds of relationships that I have, and how do I show up if you have equity and fairness initiatives that are still alive and breathing out there today in your organizations. How do men show up in those spaces? Do they show up? Right? What does that look like? And really holding themselves accountable for how they're developing their own awareness of how others may experience the workplace differently than they do. The easy part of allyship, the interpersonal part. The harder parts of allyship, and we heard this from a lot of the men that we interviewed, was really around public allyship and how now it's not just holding myself accountable, but now how I have to hold other people accountable. Because now I really feel like I'm putting some skin in the game. I'm feeling a little maybe uncomfortable, accepting a little bit of risk here. But when it's my peers or my seniors or even my organization, holding them accountable feels a little risky in that way. And then finally, we get to what we think of as systemic or organizational allyship. And now as I begin to understand how bias operates in an everyday practice that causes a systemic inequity, so like a lack of representation in senior leadership positions, for example, Well, now I have an obligation to think about how do I change the practices that are feeding into that and causing that inequity and holding myself accountable and my organization accountable for doing that work. So starting at the small and then working up. Again, we heard that earlier on the panel, and I think that's a great way to approach this and to think about it. A lot of success stories that come out of that. So the research we focused on was in a gendered context, but I would just share with you that, again, we think a lot of these skills that and actions that I'm going to mention here are really gateway skills as we think about how they might translate to other dimensions of diversity. And we certainly saw lots of examples in our own research from an intersectional perspective, thinking about how race and gender, certainly we saw different experiences for women of color than for their white female colleagues, and same actions applied, but they were a little bit different. Sometimes they were translated a little bit differently in those settings. So again, while I'm going to talk about these in terms of, we're going to think about them in terms of gender broadly, recognize that even within gender, we have differences for men, for women, for everyone within that concept. So let me give you some examples here. So interpersonal, thinking about learning how people experience the workplace differently, right? I know how I experience it. How do you experience it? Do I know how you experience it? Can I meet the needs? Can I change things to make it better for you? Developing generous listening skills. As it turns out, we as men sometimes are socialized in a way that we don't have the best listening skills. We're often in problem-solving mode. And that might be a little more of a leadership focus as well. But sometimes people don't need to have their problems solved. I don't need you to fix me or fix my problems. Just listen, be a good colleague, be a good sounding board in terms of that. And women called that generous listening. Be open to feedback, back to the feedback loop. And how do we close the gap? We need to be open to feedback, and great leaders do that. They have the humility to be open to share something with me so that I can become better as an ally and as a leader. Not making assumptions that because you're a woman, you must therefore fill in the blank. We heard this over and over again, and it was everything from mentoring and sponsoring and leadership, you name it, that, again, there were so many assumptions that were made that led us down the wrong path. Developing situational awareness of being able to see when some of these biased actions and behaviors were happening in a group setting. Often in meetings is one of those great places that we hear of these happening. Lots of them that happen. One of the ones I'll share with you that I know I reflected on a lot as I heard them over and over again in the interviews with how women would tell me about this idea they had. They were really excited about it. They put it out there to their team, and it just kind of landed flat. Nobody paid much attention to it. But 20 minutes later, some guy had the same idea, now repackaged as his own. It's like, wow, that's incredible. What a great idea. And I just remember thinking to myself, that never happens to me. And I had never seen it happen at that point, the first time I'd heard it. But now that I'm aware of it, now I can be watching for it. And this is what we're talking about, situational awareness, being attuned to what's going on around you in our space and being ready, right, when something happens to react as needed. And you can decide how you want to handle it. And by the way, some of these are so prevalent, and I'm going to mansplain this to the women in the room real quick, that you have terms for it that were, again, eye-opening for me because I have never experienced it. And so when women's ideas are stolen, we know what we call that. Bro-appropriation. You heard that one? Heap-eating, imitating. Yeah, so there's so many terms for this. It's because it is so prevalent. It's almost frustrating because when I kept hearing it over and over again. Public. Let's think about public actions. Disrupting in the moment, confronting when I hear something that's sexist biased behavior, and it's like, oh, what do I do? And we wait and we don't say anything or do anything. But we need to do something in the moment and stand up and disrupt when we hear those things. Another form of disruption, office housework or non-promotable work, and we all know what that looks like and sounds like in a variety of different settings out there. You need to disrupt that too. Maybe even create some practices for your team, your organization, so that it doesn't happen ever again, right? That's a more systemic approach. And then, of course, I think publicly and loudly advocating for women the same way we do for men, even when they're not in the room, especially when they're not in the room. Because that's, again, for the military and many other companies and organizations out there, too often that's still the case where women are not in the room, and if men don't do it, it won't happen. Systemic change, organizational change. We need to start with our senior leaders having a very clear message around why this is important to them and then why this is important to the organization. If they can't stand up and talk about it very openly and honestly, very authentically, share their own story, how are they ever going to convince anybody else to take this on? So listen to your senior leaders. Do they have a narrative? Do they have a story they use? And then they twist that or pivot it right into the organization and how that is important for our organization in accomplishing the mission of what we do every day. Increasing transparency within our organization around all people processes. We hear this all the time certainly in the civilian world. They talk about pay transparency quite a bit. Certainly promotion processes. There's a lot of information around lots of these processes that it's hidden. It's put in a corner in some place where we can't find it, we can't see it, and it's hidden. It does not develop trust in our organizations. We need more transparency about how things are done and how decisions are made. And the last one I'll say is accountability, and this is an easy one for the military, or should be anyway. We should have accountability for doing this work at every single level. And it starts at the top and goes all the way to the bottom. Everybody who's involved in it needs to be accountable for doing the work every day. What does systemic change look like? Let me just give you a quick example from my own research around performance evaluations. And certainly we see performance evaluations as being a key piece to promotions and opportunity to represent in leadership situations. One of the places where we see systemic inequities. So the research, we often know that when women lead, you've probably been told this a million times, right? There's this bit of a double bind of not being too much of this or too much of that. So when women lead in a more stereotypically masculine way, she gets labeled your favorite B word. Bossy, not the other one. And when she leads in a more stereotypically feminine way, she doesn't have what it takes to get to the next level, right? She's more participative, more collaborative. She's not a strong leader material. So again, a bit of this walking the tightrope, the double bind of that. Men don't experience it that way, right? We get a lot more flexibility when it comes to our leadership style. The question is, where does it play out? And interestingly, it's often in performance evaluations. When it comes to technical expertise, there is no difference in how we're evaluated on a performance evaluation. That's been validated over and over again. But when it comes to leadership, once you get to that leadership managerial level, suddenly now there's all these gender difference in language about how we're evaluated. So for example, in the research we did with the military, number one trait for men was analytical. Number one trait for women was compassionate. As a leader, I'd like to be seen as both. I think they're both incredibly valuable. Does one get you promoted more than the other? The one that men get, right? So when there's a gender difference in language, it's the one that men receive that leads to more promotion opportunities. So this is just an example, right? And we have interventions. We can fix that. We can change the process and we can fix that around performance evaluations. And those have largely, in many cases, been done. So that's just one example around systemic inequities. So a lot of these actions kind of seem very straightforward and they're kind of obvious in many ways, but in the context of gender for men, they can be a little daunting. And we need to provide opportunities for men to explore these with each other and women, and we need to make space for them to be able to make mistakes, right? We need to learn from that, right? That's the feedback mechanism, so we need to be able to do that. But before I close, and I'm excited for the panel we're going to have here in a little while, let me talk about one last topic that I think is incredibly important, and maybe not the most obvious around gender equity until you begin to think about it, and that is until men start showing up as allies at home, with their partners, especially if they're partnered with a woman, that it's gonna take a lot longer to get to gender equity at work, right? Why? Because we know from the research that, and everybody can talk from personal experience, that women do 2 to 3 times more of the domestic labor at home, the unpaid work, domestic responsibilities, childcare, and doing it on top of a paid job in most cases as well. Really hard, as we know, to balance all of that and to be able to be as successful at work as you want to be at the same time taking care of responsibilities at home. And so until men step up at home and start participating and leading and being a full 100% ally at home and doing their fair share, it's going to take a long time to get there. So the challenge we always love to throw out is that, hey, go home and talk to your partner. And for the guys out there, this may be the hardest thing you ever do, is ask them, do that domestic audit? Am I really showing up as an equitable partner? It may not be 50-50 because that changes over time, but am I really showing up and doing that work? The really interesting thing is that when men show up as partners and supporting their partners' careers and doing the child care and doing the relationship building with their kids, it changes their behavior at work. And we heard this from a lot of junior men we interviewed. They said that when they looked around, and the senior men that they really looked up to were those who were very transparent. They were very authentic about what their caregiving responsibilities, for example, were, what their responsibilities were at home. And when they had to leave to go take the kids to the doctor, or they had to stay home for a sick kid, they didn't slink out the back door all quiet. They went through the front door, and they were very loud. And they talked about this as this concept of leading loudly, of being very open and transparent about what I'm doing and talking about it. And the great thing about that is it begins to role model what it looks like as we begin to think about how do we integrate work life? What does that look like? And men are looking for this in the same way that women are, and it destigmatizes it for women who have been doing it for much longer than men. So very important. And then the last part of this, I would just say that remember that I think we can get to gender equity within a generation if we do this at home really well, because we're all great at being parents and socializing the next generation, your kids. And so for those who have kids, remember that when men show up as allies at home and do their fair share, and they're visible about it, and they talk to their kids about it, their sons have a more inclusive perspective of gender roles when they enter the workplace, and so they're going to think about how they integrate work life differently. And then for our daughters, are more likely to persist in their careers, reach those career dreams and goals that they have, and enter into non-traditional professions and industries, those that have been male-dominated for so long, like ours, in higher numbers. So we can make a difference if we do this at home. All right, so thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the work that you're all doing. And I know it's important work. And it's getting harder every day to stay focused on that. But the work we do to make our workplaces better and our country a better place to live is definitely worth the effort that we're putting in. So thank you for your time.